It's been a pleasure to actually be involved in this effort. I am a board certified child and adolescent psychiatrist. I finished my training in 1986 and was on the Stanford faculty for 3 years, and then went to UCSF, where I was head of child and adolescent psychiatry for 17 and a half years before retiring from there and moving to Children's Health Council and with an affiliation with Stanford. I had a long-term interest in ADHD that goes back to actually during my fellowship in the mid-'80s. In 1989, the NIMH put out a call for proposals to do a really first ever comparative trial on ADHD of medication treatment versus behavioral treatment versus the two together. And I was co-investigator at one of the 6 sites that was selected out of 21 applications for that project. For those not familiar with it, it's called the multimodal treatment of ADHD, and it really is still viewed as the gold standard of medication research, or treatment research, I should say, on ADHD. While I was at UCSF, I set up a pediatric clinical research group, and mostly we studied interventions for ADHD there. And while at CHC, I was unable to pursue research, but we did set up an ADHD clinic there as well. And so ADHD has been one of several of my interests. Medication has been my primary interest. The reason I got intrigued by what Dr. Diner was proposing, and I was one of her relatively early contacts, is that both from a research perspective and from a clinical perspective, what we lack, frankly, with all of our disorders, but including ADHD, are objective measures of whether we're having an impact. We also lack objective measures for diagnosis and assessment, but for treatment, particularly with stimulants, as you may know, especially over the past few years, I'm receiving a lot of scrutiny from both the Drug Enforcement Agency and the Federal Drug Administration. The idea of having an objective measure of whether or not somebody is responding to a particular stimulant and what level of response they're showing would be extremely valuable, I believe, both for the individual and when we're talking kids and adolescents, for the parents to feel comfortable that, yes, indeed, this medication is doing what we want it to do, but also for clinicians to know that the patient's taking the medication, that it's actually doing what they're talking about. What Dr. Diner has actually created in at least beta form is an app that really seems to be able to do exactly that, to be able to distinguish between someone with ADHD having a response to a stimulant versus not having a response. There's lots more that I personally am interested in, hope that the company is able to do over time in terms of seeing how broadly that can be applied in terms of, for example, optimal dosing, comparing one type of stimulant versus a different type of stimulant. But just the fact that we know, as we're going to see in a little bit, that this is an objective measure that correlates, which it should, with the person's perception of whether or not it benefits, it's benefiting him or her, but also it's sort of independent of that. It's not self-report. It's the other beautiful thing about it is that it's highly portable, so that it can be used in a variety of settings. One of the problems we had, I mean, we would have killed as a research team to have a measure like this when we were doing the MTA, because we're not interested just in whether it's working or not, but also what time of day it's working. And this is something that can be applied, unlike essentially any of the other measures that exist out there, at home, at school, at a variety of times. So it's would potentially revolutionize, to not overstate what I believe is possible, the way we think about demonstrating that stimulants are actually helpful with somebody well diagnosed with ADHD.
Thank you very much, and your support is super important for us. But I think it would be useful for many of the webinar participants to take a step back and share with us what, from your experience, your vast experience, would be the standard process today without iFocus of working through trying to figure out the medication for, let's say, a middle schooler that was diagnosed with ADHD.
Sure, absolutely. So this will probably be familiar to most of you, but certainly if you've got questions, we can talk about it. I do a lot of training. I have been involved in training literally since I graduated as a fellow, maybe even before that. So I have 35 years of experience. And what I teach my trainees is to pick a stimulant and get very familiar with it. And usually one in each class. As you know, there's methylphenidate in one class and amphetamine in the other class. There are bunches and bunches of different forms, some of them short-acting, some of them long-acting. What I urge residents to do is to become familiar with a product, usually an extended release product on one side, both the methylphenidate side and amphetamine side, but also to know sort of what the conversion equivalents are. And there are lots of resources out there to do that. And to then titrate, to start low and build up until you either maximize benefits or you've got side effects that are beginning to really interfere with the patient's ability to function. Usually that has things like decreased appetite and decreased sleep are by far the most common. And if one doesn't work, and this goes back to research that was done back in the 70s, we know that 65% of kids will benefit from and tolerate the first stimulant that you use, whether it's methylphenidate or amphetamine. And if they don't tolerate or show benefit from one, if you flip over to the other one, you get another 20% of kids who will show benefit with that. So roughly 85% of kids will benefit from one of the two stimulant classes and have sufficiently low side effects that they can continue on that medication. So at the moment, it's on the one hand, it's sort of nice because within treating childhood mental disorders, 65% response rate with medications is really extraordinary, let alone an 85% response rate. On the other hand, we don't know necessarily. We have to sort of talk to the parents and the kid, and we would do that anyway, about sort of when the benefit is occurring, when they'd like the benefit to occur. Is it, is it first thing in the morning? Is it the middle of the day? A lot of time there are concerns about sort of it wearing off late in the day, and we have to balance that against the appetite kinds of issues. So having an objective measure that would, potentially tell us when things are wearing off, sort of how effective it is, would certainly create more comfort for me as a clinician in making the decisions about, do I up the dose? Obviously, we're not going to get rid of any of the other things we do, like patients are still the ones that are going to have to report side effects. Although, as you can probably imagine, a lot of kids aren't great at that. But there will be other kinds of input that we'll continue to need. But the the core issue of is this actually showing benefit is really crucial. The other thing that's really changed in my professional lifetime is the use of stimulants in adolescents and adults. And this has led to concerns about diversion, about abuse, those kinds of issues. When all we're relying on is patient report, we don't have really any objective way of saying, yes, this patient A is taking the medication and B is really showing benefit from it. And again, this kind of objective measure would be reassuring, especially as the FDA and the Drug Enforcement Agency are both clamping down on how do you know that this is actually working and that the patient's actually taking it.
Thank you. No, this is really interesting. And I think in our audience, we have probably some parents and some clinicians. So I remember in one of our previous discussions, you mentioned that many times, because of the natural concerns parents have, which I know as a parent as well, of overtreating people, it can take a year till people really realize what's the right treatment. Can you talk a bit about that process, kind of coming to?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's really quick. Many of those child psychiatrists don't see the pediatricians see them. There are some kids, I've even treated some where 5 milligrams of methylphenidate and suddenly the world is different and they're doing wonderfully and you're done. They don't have any side effects. That's rare, but it happens. There are other kids who really need significantly higher doses. You're right, parents would love to know, they'd like to see evidence that this is really working. At the moment, what we do is we send questionnaires to teachers, which we probably still do, but frankly, it's difficult at times. There are a lot of teachers who are just overworked, or even some teachers who don't believe in ADHD, so they refuse to support treatment by filling out questionnaires. I literally had a teacher once who was complaining quite vociferously about a particular 8-year-old in her class, but when we sent her the questionnaire, wrote at the top of the questionnaire, I don't believe in ADHD and I'm not going to help you, and wrote 0 on all of the various items on the questionnaire. At least she was open about it, which was really helpful. But the other thing that often happens is that even parents living in the same house may have very different perceptions of what's going on, sort of how disruptive the kid is and how much help the medication is with that, let alone between the school and home. So having, again, a measure that we could do at home and at school and at different times of day might really help to provide. All of us like to see, I mean, sometimes this is bad because there are some quacks out there who are using very expensive technology to do what I'm just talking about. But all of us would like to see some objective, something in writing that shows, yes, this really is making a difference in the way your child is functioning.
Yeah, so before we dive into iFocus, I want to make sure we bring some special value to our people that joined us. If there is something you would want parents that are starting the journey with their kids now and starting to find the right treatment, the kid was diagnosed and they're starting the process, is there kind of a couple of sentences you would want them to know in terms of how to make sure they're doing the right thing, what to ask the clinician, things like that?
Yeah, I actually wrote a book about this, which I'm hoping to get another edition out. I'm not pushing the book. It's very old at this point. It was 2006, called Medicating Young Minds. That was written exactly because of the questions that you were asking. The main thing I tell parents is that they need to let the doctor, who's the prescriber, whether it's pediatrician or nurse practitioner or child psychiatrist, know what's most troubling to them. Is it mostly at school? Is it getting out of the house in the morning? So actually what I do is when I start with a new patient is to go through the whole day, from how easily does the kid wake up, and what's the morning routine like, through how easily does the kid go to bed and what's that routine like, and how much sleep does the child have and is it disrupted, and those kind of things. And as we do that, sort of find out from the parents where are the biggest problems. There are some families that are mostly worried about school. When I first started, this is much rarer now, but when I first started in the field back in the 80s, there were a lot of parents who didn't actually ever see their children on medication because back then we only had short acting, mostly methylphenidate, and they would pop it in the kid's mouth just before the child left to go to school, and hopefully the child would get a second dose during the day if they were lucky and the school was on it. And then it had worn off by the time they bounced off the bus at 3 o'clock or 3:30. And they were usually not giving it on the weekend. So that was the typical dosing pattern back in the late 70s, early 80s. So when I would ask parents, what's your child like on stimulants, their answer was usually a shrug, or we don't know, we don't see it. And one of the things I strongly encourage parents to do, often before they even start using it on a regular basis, is either on a holiday or on a weekend to give their child the medication so that they can see what effect, if any, it's having. The wonderful thing about stimulants is that, and the irritating thing, frankly, it's both, is that they are very short acting, even the so-called long acting medications. Any of the medications we currently have available in the stimulant class wear off by the end of that day, and they don't have any therapeutic benefit the next day. The good thing about that is that we can pretty rapidly ramp up the dose. If you're not seeing a benefit with a low dose, you're not going to see a benefit. That doesn't build up. So I really urge parents to start low, but to not just stay low. If they're not seeing a benefit, they need to start going up, and they can watch out for side effects, and that sort of becomes the limiting factor. And the final thing I say is, if you think there's something going on that you don't like about the medication, make sure that you tell the doctor, because we can't read minds. And one of the things I like about the app that you've developed, Adi, is that you're not just focusing on benefit, you're also giving the individual a chance to talk about side effects and how they're feeling. And I think those are very, very important as well.
Thank you very much. So thank you to everyone who joined in the last few minutes after we started, let's say. We all have ADHD, we're very patient for people that are late. So I just want to reiterate, I want to spend a few more minutes talking about iFocus, so everyone knows what we are doing and what's out there. Feel free to use this time to ask questions about treating ADHD, more general questions to Dr. Elliott, or things about iFocus if you had a chance to try it, or any other questions you might have. If you want to keep your questions private, you can privately send them to Ravid. She's here and she will collect them from the chat, and then we can ask them. Because we are recording this, as some people could not join us. So I want to show you what was the initial information that helped us start this. We were looking, my son was I have ADHD, and my son was diagnosed, and as Dr. Elliott described, I didn't like that subjective process, and I was looking for an objective measure. And part of that, we were looking at how people's eyes move when they read. And that's what I want to show you quickly. This is an example of a high schooler, successful high schooler, someone that reads well, and that has ADHD, and this is how they read without their medication. You can see the red dot is how their eyes move. Now, for those of you who have ADHD, I'm assuming this is familiar. Give us a sign if that's something you recognize. Amazing. Oh, I'm sorry. That's it. Anyone else has a thumbs up? I know it's either morning or no, it's a weekend, so people can be sleepy, but okay. And then I want to show you what happened when we had the same person get tested again after taking their medication. And this difference really struck us because it's really about how someone performs. It's how you actually read. And it's one of the things we know most people with ADHD struggle, even people that are good readers, because it's not an interesting text. It's how it's a type of school text. So this drove us to start iFocus.
Heidi, if I could just kick in, there are two things I think are really important about that. One is speed. The person is probably reading more rapidly than they were before, but the other is probably comprehension. One could imagine that some of those back tracking is that they've not quite got what's going on the first time. That's why they're back reading. So.
Yeah, and what people describe to me is I start reading and then I realize I read it down and I didn't really take in anything I read, so I had to reread it again. And we completed a study with about 100 participants, and that helped us develop an AI algorithm. AI is cool today. And we have a product out. Now, the product uses this information from it asks you to read as a baseline without the medication, and then with the medication, and uses this information to show a difference between different medications. And I can walk you through how this works, how it looks. So you log in. First time you log in, we ask for your name, date of birth, and gender. It is meant for 13 and above today because of privacy requirements. And then you get to this screen where you can test without medication or add a new medication, or in this case, after this person already had medication and it's changing medication. We ask you to test 4 times without medication because we need a baseline, and every day is not the same. And it's important to recognize that we're not the same every day, and we want something that works most of the time. And then you put in the medication you want, and we can go into those technicalities, and then you get to start testing. As Dr. Elliott mentioned, before you start, we ask you to report any side effects you might have. If it affects your sleep or your mood or your appetite or anything else. And this will be collected so you can share it with your doctor in the end. So this information we keep for you. And then we start the test itself. The first step is the camera needs to recognize your eyes. Make sure you can actually see the eyes in the image. That's the best tip I can give. If it's too dark and you cannot see the eyes, then the camera will have a hard time. If you see a lot of reflections off your glasses, that might be a problem as well. Or if there is a very strong bright light behind you. If there are any problems and you can't figure it out, feel free to reach out to us. We're working to support and make sure this works for everyone. And then you get a paragraph about this long, and you read it. Take your time, read it like you would a text you need to understand for work or school. And then we ask some comprehension questions to make sure you really read it and you understood it. And after that, we ask you how you were feeling. Did you feel the medication is working for you and is helping you? And if there's differences between this medication and something you tried before, if you did try it before. And that's it. After you do this for twice, as I said, 4 times without medication. So first time either before you start the first one or in the morning before you take the pill. And then 2 times at least with the medication. You get a report that shows you how effective the medication is and your self-report as well as side effects. You can get look at the full report with different medications you took and compare them. In this case, you can see the Ritalin works better than Adderall. Now, this is not a statement what works better. This is for the specific individual. But it's important to highlight that this strongest information for you would be what works better. We don't have, not everyone can get to highly effective, not everyone needs to, and it really depends also from where you start. So this shows improvement for yourself. That's what I wanted to show about iFocus. Anyone have questions? Feel free to ask. If you want to unmute yourself and ask, you can do that as well. If not, I can ask many questions. Dr. Elliott, many questions, but I want to give you time to ask questions. Okay, I'll start. I'll try. Oh, here I have a question. Would you expect any differences between child and adult patients? You're muted.
It's a great question. I'm not sure what you're asking in terms of differences. If you mean differences in this test, we don't have that data yet. We haven't tested children. Although there's no sort of a priori reason to believe that it wouldn't be useful. What we do know is that children and adolescents sometimes have different responses to medication, and something that works great before puberty may not work particularly well after puberty. In general, adolescents and adults have pretty similar, their needs for medication don't change a whole lot. Once you get past 16 or 17, once you're well into puberty, the brain seems to be pretty stable in terms of its response to stimulants.
And then there's another question here. Do you know why some medications work better than others?
This is a yes/no question answer. So if you look at the general population, the response rate to methylphenidate and amphetamine is identical at 65%. If you look at a specific individual, some individuals would do much better with one than the other. And there's no way to predict who's going to do better on either, which is what I mentioned before. So when the original research, which was done in, I believe, 1976, on immediate release amphetamine and methylphenidate, they blindly gave them either drug, and the response rate was 65%. Then they would, for somebody who didn't respond well to the first medication they got, they switched over to the other medication, and another 20% did better on that one, or did well on that one. So, but there was neither medication proved to be superior for the general population. So in some ways, we're talking about personalized medicine here. We need, that's one of the things we need to look at. On the other hand, if the first medication you pick works well, you're not likely to switch it to find out whether, whether there's a slight benefit of switching to the other one. And it's both a matter of benefit in terms of therapeutic response, but it's also a matter of side effects. mostly appetite and sleep, perhaps weight, height gain, which is the other problem that we have with stimulant treatments. But we don't really know that last for sure, whether switching, if one is suppressing height growth, if we switch to another one, would that be better? Interestingly enough, for kids who have tics, which is not uncommon, there are some individuals who can tolerate one stimulant without tics developing, but can't tolerate another one. So that's another situation where we might end up switching to a different stimulant. And I do want to emphasize, I didn't say that before, even though there are non-stimulants now available for treating ADHD, stimulants absolutely remain the gold standard of treatment for ADHD. The response rate is much higher than with the non-stimulants. The demonstrated efficacy, both short and long term, has been very, very well studied. So, again, what most parents really like about stimulants is that we should know within a couple of weeks whether or not the child is going to show good benefit and tolerance of the treatment.
So I think many parents are concerned about both the tics and mood effects. I think that's scary as a parent. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so the tics it's been an incredible change over my professional lifetime. About the time that I started, we were beginning to realize that stimulants don't independently cause tics. You have to be vulnerable to having a tic disorder before the stimulants have an effect. There's no question that if you're vulnerable and you take stimulants, that you have an increased risk of those tics appearing, but they don't change the course of the tic disorder. And in fact, I'm not sure who first had the willingness to even research this, but if you have somebody who has bad tic disorder like Tourette disorder and ADHD, it turns out that you can actually use stimulants even in that population. Usually, if you may want to treat the tics with some other medication, but there's an initial increase in tics when you start the stimulant that usually reduces with time, and then if you actually stop the stimulant, what happens is that the amount of tics actually decrease below baseline, and then eventually will come back to baseline. So there's no long-term adverse effect on tics. Nobody wants their child to have tics, and we do try other medications if that happens, but we're not nearly as worried about it as we used to be back in the late 70s and early 80s. And we also know a lot more about tic disorders in general. Typically, this is indeed mostly a childhood disorder. Usually, tics get worse up through, they start about 7 or 8 years of age. They get worse often up through puberty. They may continue during adolescence, but sometime during late adolescence up to the late 20s, they gradually reduce for most individuals. There are notable exceptions, and often disappear completely or come back when you're under a lot of stress, basically. And stimulants don't change that. The mood issue is a little
that's
more
very
difficult.
important to highlight that that's not the cause, right? If your kid got tics because when they started stimulants, they would have gotten it anyway.
Right. Maybe later, maybe a year or so later. What we know is that if you look at the reverse, tic disorder, individuals with tic disorders have a very high likelihood of also having ADHD. So that's where the correlation happened, is the ADHD would get picked up at age 6 or 7, the stimulants would get started, and the tics would emerge a little earlier. The average tic child with Tourette disorder, at least, ticks emerge around age 8. They can emerge much earlier than that, but 8 is the average. But yeah, they don't cause ticks, and they don't change the course of the tick disorder. That really is an independent disorder. The mood issue is a little trickier. There are some kids who have they may feel more emotionally unstable while they're on the stimulant. That often may not be biologic. It may be that they're organized enough that they realize how much disruption they were causing and how upset people were with them while they're on stimulant that they didn't really recognize when they were untreated. Or it may, it is one of those things where if somebody's having a lot of mood problems while they're on the stimulant, you definitely want to think about trying a different stimulant. And sometimes that can help. There's also a well-documented, probably 25 to 30% of kids will have a period as the stimulant wears off where they become more emotionally fragile, more irritable, and that kind of thing. Some parents are convinced it's related to not eating, because usually lunch is kind of a lost cause, so they may not have eaten since breakfast. And they'll give them a snack, and that may be better. We don't really know what the cause of that is, there's a variety of things that we can try. Feeding actually is not a bad thing. Interestingly enough, some of the longer acting stimulants are less likely to do that because they wear off more slowly later in the day.
Yeah, so we that's one thing we did experience as a family. Another, I think, interesting point about side effects in general, and I know that can happen with the mood part, is how would you talk about side effects when you're underdosed? Because sometimes I think you might see more side effects even the dose is too low. Is that correct?
I don't know that you'd see more side effects. Usually side effects happen as you start. So sort of whatever dose you start with, particularly the appetite suppression and the sleep problems, both of those typically get better as the child gets used to the medication. So if you've got somebody who's never been on meds before, whatever dose you start with, that's when you're going to see probably the most significant side effects. They are dose dependent, so you may see worse side effects as you go up, but usually within I'd say 2 weeks, the side effects diminish. They may not completely go away. Sleep is appetite. Appetite suppression at lunch is almost universal, and that's not going to go away. The emotionality and the trouble getting to sleep, both of those often will resolve with time, partly as the body just adjusts to the new condition. But if it doesn't, we've got additional medications that we can help with that may actually both help with additionally with the ADHD and also decrease particularly the sleep onset problem. The biggest problem is sleep onset. They just have a delay. The average delay is about a half hour, which at one level doesn't seem like much, but in another level can be just enough to tip the kid into not getting enough sleep, which doesn't help. Yeah. And that's average. There are kids who can't get to sleep for an hour or 2 hours, and that's obviously unacceptable.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is very important information with all the noise out there. I think one thing I'm personally struggling with, and I know other parents are, is to find what's real and what's scientific and what's an anecdote or driven by not enough data, let's say it that way. I want to kind of open the floor again. Feel free to ask questions about clinical issues and also about using iFocus if anyone tried it. We're here to answer any questions. And if you want to do this private, you can ask them privately to me or to Ravid or Inat in the chat. So I'll use this time to tell you about my recent experience. You know, I was diagnosed in my 30s, and I've been taking medication throughout this time. And changing in the beginning, what drove me changing medication is because I learned there are other options. I think many adult psychiatrists are not very experienced, especially back then. So I started on slow acting, and then I looked for something that is longer, and I tried that. And but now I'm changing medication because of hormonal changing and premenopause. And I started a new medication, and as we launched, I focused. And I found that in the morning, the performance was pretty similar. And that made sense to me. But I could actually see a pretty big difference in the afternoon at 4 o'clock. And that's part of my personal biggest struggle, because I need to work beyond 4 o'clock, right? And to get things done. And I don't, and if I can't focus after that time, it gets really hard. So I'll show you the results I got. And this doesn't have the specific medication because I know it is my experience. But so here you can see the top is the old medication and the bottom is the new one. I didn't have much side effects. I don't know how the mood was significant, but you could really see that for the old prescription, by 4 o'clock, I was almost like I had taken almost no medication. But for the new one, you can actually see an effect. And this was, and I'll admit, it took me a while because I had to set a reminder to get tested in the afternoon and not forget about it. And that's a challenge that we're working to solve. But I had a reminder every day, and then some days you have a meeting, so you don't do it, or you didn't eat on time, and then I'm annoyed I didn't want to get tested. So it took me, I think, a week or something till I got these 2 tests. But it's exciting to be able to see that. And then when I go to the doctor and tell them, no, this is the dosage I need, it's much easier discussion.
Yeah, and eventually your hope is that if patients want to, or if individuals want to do that, the doctor can automatically get these data, which I can tell you as a clinician, going into a session with data like that would be really, really useful.
Yeah. So right now with the current initial product, you can email the data to the clinician, including a report that has which days you tested and exactly what side effects you reported each day. But down the line, we'll share that with the clinician. We're just making sure we're doing it right in terms of privacy. So right now, the patients have the full control of their data. What will also happen down the line is that right now you open the web page and you start testing. Down the line, it will be a plugin, and it will be much easier to test. And you will be able to use the text you're actually reading for work or for school. Right now, it takes 2 or 3 minutes. It's a 300-word paragraph, so it's not too bad, but it's not fun. But down the line, you'll be able to use the actual text you need to read anyway. Any other questions from anyone? Everyone is super quiet. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want. Okay, so no, we don't need to do it. Feel free to reach out to me or Inat or Ravid with any questions. If there's anything, we can always reach out to Dr. Elliott if there's anything that we need.
Absolutely.
And
I want to emphasize is really, part of the reason for this webinar is we need more people to test this out. And Adi, maybe you could talk about what the arrangements are now
Yes, exactly. So we launched our initial product, a beta, and that's why it's free for now. And we're looking for people to use it so we can see it works, mostly to get your feedback about how easy it is to use it, and what improvements would you want? Because a thing about making a product, as I'm learning, is you can theoretically think about it all you want, but until people actually use it and give you feedback, it's not done. And that's why we need your help. And also to improve the algorithm. The way AI algorithms work, they're as good as the amount of data we have. So we have 100 people, that's not bad. But as we get more, it will be more accurate, and we'll be able to give a more accurate scale. That would be the most significant improvement that we expect. So I'll email anyone who signed up to the webinar with both the recording and with the information about how to sign up. We are here, Ravid and Nat and myself, to answer any questions and solve any problem you might have. We're happy to hop on the Zoom with you and share the screen. Because together, and I really see this as something we're doing together with the community, we want to make a difference. Now, there's one more question. If I use the app for testing myself, how can I check if with medication if I do not have it? So to use the app, you do need to have medication to check it. It's not supposed to diagnose ADHD. Right. Diagnosing ADHD, in my opinion, there are many reasons why you need an expert, but I think one thing that is important to emphasize is there are many reasons that can cause you to have issues with concentration, and you need to sit down with a doctor that actually understands and goes through. And these are things that we're not measuring. We're not asking you your medical history or anything like that. But it is meant to test if the medication you already have prescribed is working for you. It can work, as I said, also for kids. So what I did with my son, I set him up with a laptop. It can be a Chromebook, and I asked the school to let him use it in recess for 5 minutes and get tested then, because we're asking to get tested when you need it to work best. That's the most important part. Well,
that's a really important point. It would be, at the moment, most of your data is with adolescents and adults. Again, this is not intrusive in any way, so it's not gonna, if a kid's computer competent, and frankly most kids are by the age of 5 or more competent than I am, they can easily do this. So
the reading text is a middle school reading. In terms of privacy laws, we are 13 and above. So that's the requirement we need to put in there. What you let your kid do, I'm not telling you what to do, but those are the laws in California. Addressing kids younger than that is very different. And we wanted this product out as fast as we could to start giving benefit and getting the data. And that's why we are limiting the use to 13 and above and keeping the data with the patients, because that lets us do the right thing, keep privacy, so not risk your privacy while getting the product out as quickly as possible. That's why this is something that will change. But as Dr. Elliott mentioned, if you have a kid that reads about middle school level, it's your call what you let them do. And we believe this is, I know how frustrating this phase is when you hear all these scary things about medication. And how do you know it works? Like a friend told me, I know all the cons, all the bad things about medication. How do I know what's really happening? And that's what we're trying to do. So we'll give you 5 minutes back. Thank you, everyone. Feel free to reach out again with any questions. And I thank you so much, Dr. Elliott, for taking your time for this webinar and for your support as we go around, and your belief, because it's super important for us.
Absolutely. I think this is not what 80 is mostly focused on, but I also believe it's going to be an incredibly valuable tool for researchers. And ultimately, I hope that that becomes possible as well as the product gets established, because there's nothing out there like this that would allow researchers to look at the effect of stimulants over time in a research kind of setting. So there's lots of potential applications, but what we're doing right now is itself extremely valuable, which is just to see, is the medication actually there and working, and how does that jibe with what the patient is reporting.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for taking the time, and anyone that is watching this as a recording, feel free to reach out with any questions.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.